Hello everybody, and welcome to another edition of Your Gardening Week. This is the place to come and get your gardening questions answered and hear the answers to a lot of other gardeners' questions as well. I'm Gardener Scott, and I discuss everything gardening so that you can become a better gardener. And by my estimate, over the course of the next 90 minutes, we'll be discussing between 30 and 40 different gardening topics. So I look forward to hearing your questions. If you're watching this on replay, you can still be involved. Go ahead and ask your questions below. And if you're just getting started with this channel, this happens every Monday at the same time. So I hope you'll join us in the future if you're just discovering it now. Let's go ahead and start looking at everybody checking in from all over the United States and Canada. I've seen a lot of people that are returnees, and I appreciate that. Thank you so much for that. This is the Memorial Day edition. Here in the United States, it's Memorial Day, which is a national holiday. So I'm hoping many of you might have the day off today if you are back to work. And I appreciate your time participating in the GardenerScott channel and this live stream that we do every Monday. I've had a pretty good week. Tell me about your week. What did you do in the garden? I actually, yesterday, had the first real rain of the entire year. We've been extremely dry, and we had rain yesterday. And just like I've talked about over the last couple of weeks with a false spring, last night got down to about 37 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 3 degrees Celsius. So I've been hardening off my tomato plants. I haven't put them outside yet because I knew this would happen. My last frost date was a week ago, and I never put those warm season plants in the ground until at least 2 weeks after the last frost, and it's exactly because of nights like we had last night. So how's your weather? How's your gardening activities? And what are you doing in the week ahead? Let me know. Linda, so glad to see that you are finally able to join live. And we've got Massachusetts, Stephen from Centennial, Colorado. That's just up the road from me. Lorenzo is back from Oklahoma. We've got Montreal, Dallas, Central California, Amarillo. I haven't been to Amarillo in probably close to a year, but I love driving through that town. Alabama, a lot of United States people today. So it's wonderful to see you. Let's go ahead and jump into the first topic. This one comes from Brandon Garrett last week. He said, anyone else have a glut of seedlings and not enough garden space? What do you guys do with your leftover plants after you have filled the garden? If you're anything like me, you always end up starting from seed more plants than you could possibly use. And I'm having to deal with this issue this year as well. One thing is to try to find more space. And that's one reason why I've done the recent videos with the containers that I'll be gardening in. That buys me a little bit extra space. But for the most part, I share my extra plants and I share my extra seeds, and I encourage that you do the same. My neighbor offered to buy some of my tomato seedlings, and I said, no, you're getting them for free. I think that's a great way to foster this whole gardening community. We don't have to make a buck in it, and we don't have to try to sell what we're growing. Grow extra on purpose, and then share it. Share it with people you know, share it with people you don't know. We've had a lot of questions on this channel in the last couple weeks about new gardeners that are having trouble finding seeds and plants because the nurseries are just being picked clean. You might be able to help one of those new gardeners. If you've been gardening for a while and you've been starting plants from seed and you have extra, well, maybe do something like Craigslist. Just put a call out that you've got some extra plants for new gardeners, and I'm sure you'll be able to get them off your hands pretty quickly. So I'm a big advocate in sharing what you do if you're a gardener, and the extras is a great way to spread the word. Okay, we got the Finger Lakes represented from Gary, Montgomery, Alabama. Sandy, it's good to see you. So nice to have everybody here today. I look forward to this every week, and I hope you do too. And if you're just discovering, Like I said before, I hope you'll join us every week. Last week we had a lot of questions and some discussion about pollination. And I wanted to go ahead and talk about that subject as well today, because I know it's one of those areas that can be confusing, especially if you're new. What's the difference between open pollinated and hybrids? And if you want to save seeds from an open pollinated plant, do you have to worry about cross pollination? And it really can be confusing. So here's the basic idea. When you hear about open pollinated plants, those are plants that are often referred to as heirlooms. But while every heirloom is open pollinated, not every open pollinated plant is an heirloom. But the idea is that you can save the seeds from those plants and expect to get the same type of plant, whatever it is, whether it's an open pollinated heirloom bean or pea or tomato or pepper, the seeds will bear true to the parent. With a hybrid, that's not the case. A hybrid is a seed that was pollinated by two different types of plants. And so the hybrid will have attributes of each of the parents. If you plant a hybrid seed, there's no guarantee what you're going to get. And now the confusion arises because hybrids are created by cross-pollination. So if you're growing open pollinated plants that you want to save the seed from, there's the risk of cross-pollination. And now the seed that you're saving could potentially be a hybrid. Well, there are some plants that those concerns really aren't anything to be worried about. Tomatoes, for instance. Tomatoes have both the male and female parts within the flower, and they are almost always going to pollinate themselves. As soon as a bee lands on a flower, some of the pollen is going to drop and it's going to be pollinated before the bee even reaches inside the flower. A breeze will cause flowers like that to pollinate. So you can almost always expect that your tomato seeds will bear true if they're not a hybrid. Where you have to be more concerned is with squashes and melons, the really big flowers, because there's lots of insect activity and the wind, and they are much more likely to be cross-pollinated. Now, don't worry about cross-pollination within the same season. So cross-pollination is only a concern if you're saving seeds. If you're not saving the seeds, don't worry about it. If you have a yellow squash that happens to cross-pollinate with a long neck yellow squash, and they're two different types, well, the fruit is still going to develop per the original parent plant. Cross-pollination has no effect on fruit growth or fruit taste in a particular year. A flower will need to be pollinated for fruit to develop, but the cross-pollination is only a concern if you're saving seed. So as you're growing, don't be so worried about cross-pollination. If you want to save the seed, here's what I do. I will stagger my plantings. So let's say I want to save the seed of a particular squash, and I know that another squash I'm growing could potentially cross-pollinate. I'll start growing squash A early in the season. Those flowers will come, they'll pollinate, and I'll have fruit. When I have a fruit from that plant, I'll go ahead and save the very first fruit, the ones that were pollinated right away. And then a couple weeks later, I will have started squash B. Well, by the time squash B flowers and fruits, I've already got the fruit developing on plant A. That's the way to deal with cross-pollination if you're going to save seed. In this year, I would not save seed from plant B because there's a chance it could be cross-pollinated from plant A. Now, I know that kind of sounds confusing, but the idea is if you want to save seed, do try to keep that plant separate and away from other type of plants that might cross-pollinate it. So this is a really deep subject. I'll be doing a video about this in the months ahead and actually show you how you can intentionally hand pollinate some of those bigger flowers. But for now, don't worry too much about cross-pollination, especially if you're growing plants like peppers and tomatoes, because they'll take care of themselves. Nina, thank you so much for that super chat. Followed with a question. How should we store extra soil we had delivered? We have several yards. That's an interesting question. And I've got that problem right now. I had 15 yards of soil delivered last month. I've been filling my beds with it, and I still probably have about 4 or 5 yards that still needs to be moved. What I do when I have the extra is just find a back corner of the yard and keep it there until I can use it. Then what I do is just build more beds to put that soil into it. So as far as storage, put it in an out-of-the-way spot if you can. And then I would encourage that you cover it with a tarp or plastic or some other type of material, because if you've just got a big pile of soil sitting out in the open, weed seeds are going to blow in, and now you're going to have to deal with that when it comes time to using that soil. So try to use as much as you can. If you've got several yards and you've got space, this could be a great opportunity for you to expand your garden, either by building more raised beds and then filling it with the soil, or just take that soil. I'm assuming it's better soil than what you have natively. And so even take an open area. Raised bed doesn't need to be built out of wood or stone or metal. A raised bed can be simply 6 inches of soil bed on top of other soil. So if you're looking to create a whole new bed, go ahead and take some of that soil and just create a mounded area and start planting in it. You don't even need walls. So there's a couple ideas. I hope that helps. Vidal is asking, hey, GardenerScott, have you tried the new honey nut squash? I haven't. I grow butternut squash every year, but I'm not familiar with the honey nut squash. I'll have to look into that. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. Scott, good to see you checking in from the UK. Zeddy in Oklahoma, but originally from Malaysia. That's wonderful. Finally able to get on the live video, and I'm glad you're here as well. So wonderful that everyone's checking in. Xavier's asking, is adding rotten plant waste as mulch a problem? And so rotten is a relative term. Rotten implies that it's wet and squishy and smelly. So I would not add smelly, rotten material to my garden. But if you just let it dry out for a brief period of time, absolutely. That's essentially what compost is. It's just decomposed plant matter. So I use a lot of plant material, a lot of dead plants throughout my garden. I practice something that's called chop and drop, where as I clean up the garden and as I prune, if I cut off something or break off a small branch, I just let it drop to the ground. And that starts creating a natural mulch. So I mulch a lot with just clippings and leaves and plant parts. So absolutely do that. As far as rotten, I prefer to use the term decomposed. So if you've got a lot of material, go ahead and put it in a compost pile or create a compost pile and then use the compost. But if you don't want to go to that practice, by all means, you could just use plant clippings on your garden as a mulch. They'll do fine. Okay, let's get to another question from last week. Playfish99 was asking, will twine eventually break mid-season if you use it to train tomato plants up a trellis? So if you've seen my couple of videos about tomatoes and the trellis that I make and how I use twine to grow up the trellis, the twine I use is not a natural twine. You can get twine that's made out of jute, which is a natural plant-based product, but the twine I use is, I think it's polyethylene based. Basically, it's a man-made material, and it will last for years. It won't break down. If you're using a natural type of twine or a cotton twine, then yes, it is very possible that with the weight of the tomato plant growing up it could break somewhere in the season. And that's one reason why I use the artificial twine, because it's not going to break. I make sure that I get a twine that has a strength of at least 40 to 50 pounds, so it can handle the weight of the tomato plant. So if you are selective in your twine, then you don't have to worry about it breaking down. Okay, Jennifer, I cannot go and get more soil. I do have some large containers with soil from last year. Could I sift the soil and add a fertilizer to it and reuse it? Certainly. As always, I would caution about just blindly adding a fertilizer without knowing what the nutrient level is within the soil, because if the soil already has ample nutrients, you won't need to add any fertilizer. And I prefer to add compost or aged manure rather than fertilizer. But by all means, go ahead and use the soil that you have. That's a great way to reuse natural materials and not have to pay for things that you might otherwise have to buy. Okay, Mayra, I'm using Hugoculture, using my tips. Good luck. It's a wonderful system, and there are many gardeners that garden almost exclusively in Hugoculture. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go ahead and check out my video on that subject. Lots of organic material in the soil when you practice that, and it can actually benefit you. In a dry area like mine, all of those buried branches, all of that buried organic material, it acts like a big sponge. And so it helps the soil stay moist at root level and below when everything else is so dry. And yesterday was my first rain, which means until yesterday, everything was very dry. So, Rob OX, hi Scott, my husband died from cancer, so this is the first time I've been able to tune in for weeks. Happy to be here and hope you're well. I'm so sorry to hear that. My condolences go out to you, and I'm very sorry that you've had to deal with this during this time. But thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentation, and I hope you have a wonderful gardening season. But I feel the pain and fully appreciate your loss. Thank you for sharing that with us. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. Diane D is asking, can you use whole dried pine cones as a mulch? I prefer to crush the pine cones. I do use pine cones as a mulch, but what I'll do is either put them in a bag or put them on a sidewalk and then just stomp all over them with my old worn out boots. And they'll flake off pretty easily. Each of those little circular layers of the pine cones will separate. Then I'll use it as a mulch. It spreads a little bit better. It's got more even coverage if they're broken. But yes, definitely pine cones are a good option for mulch. Okay, let's get to another question, and this kind of ties in with the cross-pollination idea. It came from Heat Cap. Is it okay to plant two kinds of strawberries in the same bed? Absolutely. You can plant multiple types of raspberries, multiple types of strawberries, different types of blackberries, different type of blueberries. This last week I put in some aronia bushes. I put in 3 different type of aronias in a different bed. I've got 4 different type of currants. You can definitely separate the plants by different types in the same bed if you choose. Because most of the time, particularly with strawberries and all the other fruits, we're not saving the seed. So if there's a concern about cross-pollination, like I said earlier, you shouldn't have that concern. The fruit is going to grow, you're going to eat it, you're not going to save the seed, and everything's going to be great. With strawberries, however, I personally prefer to separate my strawberries into different beds just because they'll often fruit at different times depending on what variety I have. And so it helps me track how well the strawberries are doing when I can clearly identify which type of strawberry is which, just because I'm tracking those type of things. But as far as just growing different types of strawberries together, definitely go for it. Lorenzo Lamas, good to see you again, and thank you for that super chat. Have you ever heard of or used a Su Bioreactor for composting? We plan on building one this year. I have heard of it. I considered getting a system like that for the Galileo garden. I have not used it, and so I can't give you any personal information or anecdotes about how well it works, but based on what I've seen, it looks to be a pretty efficient system, and you can take your garden and yard waste and kitchen waste and have compost in a much shorter time than just an open pile in the backyard. So let me know how that goes. I'd encourage you to go ahead and try it and compost in it, and then share with me in the future how it turned out. And it might be something, I'm always looking for something new to try in the garden. So that could be one of those things. Thanks for the suggestion. Okay, Chad H. Hi, GardenerScott and all. I'm a newbie from San Antonio. I love San Antonio. Question, planted some squash and zucchini that are all over each other. Seems I've heard of vertical gardening. Can you comment on that process, please? Yes, definitely use vertical gardening when you've got squash going everywhere. It works better when the plants are young, but the idea is that you put up a trellis, and instead of allowing the plants to just sprawl across the ground, you train them to grow vertically up the trellis. And this works for a number of great reasons. Once the plants just are going to grow towards the sun, so in many cases they're going to grow better. They're going to be off the ground, so you won't have the mildew and disease problems that could potentially arise if they're growing on the ground. But also, as the fruit develops, it will start hanging off of the trellis. It's real easy to see, real easy to harvest, and you can fit more plants into a given bed if you're growing them up a trellis than if you let them sprawl. So I do have a couple videos on growing tomatoes vertically and how to trellis it. If you haven't seen those videos, look at them, and that'll help give you an idea, because I use the exact same system to grow squash and cucumbers and things like that. Stephen Hopper, thank you so much for the super chat. It's greatly appreciated. Let's go ahead and move to another question from last week. King Bacchus I asked, is yeast a good fertilizer? I would say no. You know, yeast is one of those things that, first off, if you buy yeast and put it in your garden, it's probably going to have no effect at all, and you will have wasted some good money. Now, yeast being similar to the fungi that might be growing in your soil, I've seen people that recommend these kind of things. The assumption being that all fungi are the same and there's a lot of fungi in soil, so if I add something like that to my soil, my plants will benefit from it. Well, there are all kinds of different types of fungi, and soil fungi is different than the surface fungi, the spores that are blowing around. So don't use yeast. Instead, use organic material in your soil. The bacteria and the fungi will naturally be there. They will expand their population because of that extra food in the soil, and that's what will end up giving the plants nutrients. So as a fertilizer, I wouldn't think of fungi as a fertilizer. It's part of the process that allows the organic material in the soil to release the nutrients in a form that plants can use. Okay, Diane D is asking, what do you use to tie up your squash, zucchini, cucumber to the trellises? So I'll often use the same twine that I'm allowing the plants to grow vertically up. But if you look at my tomato trellis video, I discovered a few years back tomato clips. And it's just a little plastic clip that you put around the twine, and then it attaches to itself. It's just a little circle that goes around the stem, and it attaches to the twine. It's big enough that it's not going to strangle the stem, and it's very strong to support the plant growth. So check out my video where I show the tomato clips, or you can actually just Google tomato clips and see different sources for where you can get them. They're very inexpensive. They're reusable. I've been using my clips for 3 or 4 years now, and they're still going strong. So that's what I really like to use now, is the tomato clips. If I'm out in the garden and I notice that something needs to be tied up, I'll often have some twine and my utility knife with me, and I'll just tie it up. But if I'm planning to trellis plants, I'll use the tomato clips. Okay, let's go ahead and get back to another question. I told you we're getting 30 to 40 different topics this week. That's the plan. So Lilia Cordoso was asking, will peas grow in summer in zone 9B? So off the top of my head, I'm going to say no, but that's because most peas don't grow very well during the heat of summer, regardless of the zone. And this gets back to a discussion I had a couple weeks ago about zones and last frost date. And when you're growing these annual vegetable crops, like peas and beans and tomatoes and squash, your zone has nothing to do with how well these plants are going to grow. Instead, you need to look at your seasonal weather, your climate where you live, and that will help determine whether plants will grow or not, whether it's too hot in your region or not. So, for instance, there are areas of Arizona and New Mexico that are also zone 9B. They're getting to 120 degrees in the summer. You can't grow any plant at 120 degrees in your vegetable garden. So you might be zone 9B in an area of Mississippi or South Carolina. You're not getting that hot. So you'll still be able to grow plants in 9B where someone in Arizona can't. That's why I say the zone has nothing to do with whether your plants will survive or not. You have to look at the weather extremes. And peas are a cool weather plant. If it gets too hot, they're not going to be producing. You might be able to do it if you're not in an extreme heat area. If you use some shade cloth and you put the peas in an area where they're sheltered from the really harsh sun, it's possible. It's one of those things to experiment with. But generally, most of us that are growing peas stop growing them in early summer, and then I'll use that same bed and start growing something else. Okay, the Mrs. Marvel is saying those little clips are great. Yeah, just discovered them this season, has decided to invest some money in those little clips. They are wonderful. So I'm glad you can substantiate my claim. Harley Horton is asking, what's your opinion on handheld soil moisture sensors? I'm not a huge fan of those. I've had many over the years. The problem is you'll put them in the soil, they work pretty well the first few times, but then the tip starts getting corroded, or you leave them in for a long period of time and then it seems to be a little wacky as far as what the reading pops up for, because you really can't adjust what's wet and what's not wet. So they're okay for a brief period of time. As I've said before, I think the best moisture meter is your finger. Just go ahead and put your finger into a pot or a bed or the open ground, and that's the best indicator of what the moisture level is. You can go ahead and try it, and one thing that I've learned is if you leave the soil meter in the soil, the readings will become less and less accurate. If you put it in the soil, get a reading, and then take it out and clean off the probe, then it's more likely to last longer and to give you more accurate readings. Thomas Glasscock, thank you so much for that super chat. And I'm so glad that I can help you. I appreciate your gratitude. I love doing this. I've said that before. I'll continue to say that. It's one of those things that I think we should all be enjoying gardening. And it's so wonderful to see everybody on here because we're a community working together and sharing the information. Okay, it's that time in the show for the lightning round. So I picked 15 questions from previous weeks that will have a pretty short answer, and we'll go ahead and get into it, see if maybe this is something that might be on your mind this week. Denver 1865, any tips on preventing powdery mildew in a pumpkin patch? So cucumbers, melons, squashes can be very susceptible to powdery mildew. Much of it is heat related, so you'll tend to see powdery mildew later in the season when the days are really starting to get nice and hot. The best thing you can do is improve air circulation. So if you've got a whole bunch, in this case, of your pumpkins with the leaves overlapping and it's just filled with pumpkins and pumpkin leaves, it's very likely you're going to have powdery mildew. But if you use a system like vertical gardening, for instance, you can grow pumpkins up a trellis. That increases the airflow. Increased air circulation will reduce the possibility of powdery mildew. Lee Geitzen-Tanner, thank you so much for that super chat. My 11-year-old asks, if I save seeds from a non-organic transplant that I grow organically, will the seeds qualify as organic? Yes and no. I talked about this a few weeks ago as well. So a certified organic seed means that it was produced by a grower that was certified. In the United States, it's through the USDA, certified as organic. Okay? The seed that you save from that plant cannot be designated certified organic unless you are a certified grower. However, now we get into the basic philosophy of organic growing. If you're growing organically and you're using organic seed, when you save seed, from my perspective, yes, absolutely, that seed is organic seed. It won't know where it came from. It just knows that it grew from a healthy parent with a gardener who cared about plants. So don't worry so much about the classification and whether it qualifies as organic, because in the technical sense it doesn't, but in my mind, absolutely. If you use organic seed and grow organically and then save that seed, you have qualified as an organic gardener, and all of the seeds you save will be organic. So thanks for that question. Okay, John Wood had asked, a new raised strawberry bed is filled with composted manure. Will I need to fertilize this year? This is one of those maybes. Manure will take a little bit of time to decompose in the soil, as does compost. Once that organic material decomposes in the soil, now all of its nutrients are available for the plants to use. If you're using any organic material that hasn't broken down yet, and when you add it to the soil, it's going to begin or continue its decomposition process, it will take some nitrogen from the soil. So in most cases, until the organic level of your soil has increased to 5% and above, in most of those cases, you'll probably need to at least use a nitrogen fertilizer just to counteract some of that nitrogen depletion in the soil. But once your soil has nutrients, a lot of organic material, even when you add new organic material, you're not going to need to fertilize at all because it just mixes in with the other nutrients. And Colorado State University had done some studies a while back, and that's one of the reasons that 5% is recommended. If you get up to a 5% level of organic material in your soil, then you'll probably never need to fertilize again. That supplies ample nutrients to your soil. Roxanne Voigt was asking, have you ever had trouble with moles getting in your raised beds? No. Believe it or not, Colorado does not have moles. So I'm very lucky in that respect, and I've never had to deal with them. The Mrs. Marvel had asked, what was your MOS when you were in the Air Force? And the MOS is basically the designation of what your job is. And I was actually a pilot. I flew, this is the model behind me, the KC-135. That's what I flew for much of my career in the Air Force. And then I came to the Air Force Academy where I was running the airfield operations, the flight operations, and flew a couple different types of airplanes, helping to teach the Air Force cadets to fly here at the Air Force Academy. So my whole career I was in the pilot field and doing a job that was somehow related to being a pilot. It was wonderful. Okay, 420 Hi Guy is asking, if your garden is clay, what amendments would I put in to help break up the terrain? Organic material. If you've got sandy soil, organic material is the best thing to put in it to fix it. If you've got clay soil, the best thing is to put organic material in to fix it. I've got a video about soil, if you haven't seen it, where I help explain more about pore spaces and soil structure and soil texture. But organic material for gardeners is just about the best thing you can do to improve your soil, regardless of what type it is. Okay, I didn't write down who this came from. If I'm keeping biennial plants for seed cultivation, do I need to protect them from snow and freezing ground during winter? So there are many plants. I did a video that showed how to collect carrot seeds. Carrots are biennials, where you'll grow them in the first season. We normally harvest them in that first season, but then you leave them in the ground over the winter and collect their seeds in the second season. It's a process that takes a full year from when you start to when you collect the seeds. In most cases, being in the ground with a mulch on top of it is enough to protect those plants. So I'm in zone 5B. We get down to conceivably minus 20 Fahrenheit. The year that I made the video about saving the carrot seeds, I think we got down to about minus 10 that year. And the carrots just totally grew like normal in spring and then flowered and produced the seeds. So in most regions, you can just leave them in the ground, put a good layer of mulch. I use straw and leaves over the winter, and the plant should come back. You shouldn't need any extra protection. If you're in a very cold area and for some reason the biennial you're planting might be a little more tender, you might need some extra protection. But in most cases, you don't. Angel Mist asked, what grows well in Florida sand? I've never grown plants in Florida, but I'll give you this answer. You've probably never grown plants in Colorado. So if I were to recommend a plant that grows well in Colorado, it probably wouldn't grow well in Florida. So for all of you, whether you're in Florida or Canada or someplace else in the world, the best way to find out what plants grow best in your particular soil, in your particular region, is to ask an expert where you live. In the United States, we have the Extension Service. So you can go to your local extension office and they'll be able to tell you exactly what plants can grow and what will do best. So I could throw out all kinds of recommendations, plants that I think would do well, but I've never grown in Florida. So try to seek out some experts in your area. They'll be able to answer that question much better than me. Carla Garner, thank you so much for that super chat. I appreciate your statement. Thanks for all your quality presentations. I do try to give you as much quality as I can, and thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. Okay. Liliet Cordoso was asking, does overhead watering on a sunny day burn leaves? No, it really doesn't. Those little droplets do not act as magnifying glasses on the leaves. Now, yes, you might see some damage on leaves if you water during the day. But more likely, it's because the plant is very stressed. And I'm assuming the reason you're watering on a hot day is because the plants need water. So if a plant is stressed and you water it, it could possibly cause some damage just because the leaves were already stressed and there might have already been some cellular damage in the leaves. Believe it or not, leaves can get sunburned. And so when you water, and this is kind of what I've seen, you water a leaf and part of the leaf gets nice and wet and moist and it doesn't have any damage at all. And some of the edges that don't receive that water, because the plant was thirsty and wilty, the edges might dry and burn a little bit. But it's usually not because of the water. There are some plants that are sensitive to water, but for most of the time, it's just because it was a hot day and the plant was already stressed. Think about rain. If water droplets were burning leaves, then no plants would look pristine, because every time it rained, they'd end up with little spots and damaged areas of their leaves. And you know that doesn't happen. So don't worry about watering during the middle of the day as far as burning your leaves. More importantly, water earlier in the day so the plant isn't stressed going into the heat of the day. Luciano Cordova, can you use citrus in compost? Absolutely. In fact, citrus in compost might actually deter some animals like cats that don't like some citrus. It's organic material. Use it in your compost. It might take a little bit longer to decompose compared to some of the other organic material in your compost pile, but I throw orange peels and lemon peels and limes in my compost all the time. Riley Carroll, what vegetables do you recommend planted near pine trees? I wouldn't recommend any vegetables planted near pine trees, or any trees for that instance. And it's not because of the myth that pine trees will acidify the soil. It's because a lot of trees, especially pine trees, have very extensive root systems. And with all those roots in the soil, your vegetables aren't going to be able to grow. Also, all those pine tree roots, they're sucking up all the water in the soil. That's going to deprive your vegetables of the water they need and the nutrients they need. So you can plant near pine trees, but this is a great reason for growing in a raised bed. Put a raised bed near a tree, put some good soil in it, then you'll be able to grow your vegetables. Do take into account the shade and the sun, because that's one of the biggest reasons plants aren't growing underneath trees, because the trees are just shading them. They're not getting enough sun and they can't survive. Life with Aura, thank you for that super chat. Thanks for all the information you give us. Stay safe. You stay safe as well. Memorial Day in the United States is the traditional non-official start of summer. And there's a lot of people getting out, doing a lot of group activities. I definitely encourage all of you to stay safe as we move forward, because we're not sure what the future is going to bring. Okay, Bruce Gordon, what would you recommend for raised beds made with wood to reduce the possibility of wood rot? I think it's great to use a wood preserver or paint on your raised beds. In my area, I actually find that the outside of the beds break down faster than the inside of the bed. And that's because of the heat, the dry humidity, the winds. The wood on the outside tends to actually dry out faster and break down. The wood on the inside is moist and doesn't break down as quickly. It's probably going to be the opposite if you live in a very wet region. So feel free, especially on the outside, paint your bed with whatever you want. Whatever paint you put on the wood on the outside of the bed, it's not going to affect your plants at all. And it won't affect the soil because it's not even touching the soil. On the inside of the bed, where the wood touches the soil, I'm still not that concerned. Most wood preservers are fine, but there's a lot of eco-friendly wood preservers out there. They're kind of hard to find. You usually have to ask for them at the store. They're often copper-based, but that's an option to try to keep your wood lasting as long as possible. Riley 22176, what do you think about mixing charcoal in your compost? So if you've seen my videos where I mention biochar, I think biochar is an amazing thing to add to your compost. And it's actually better to add it to your compost than to add it directly to your soil. Biochar is a type of carbon. It's like charcoal. Where you have to be careful if you're asking about adding charcoal to the compost pile. What is the source of that charcoal? And how burned is it? Biochar goes through a special process called pyrolysis, where it burns out all of the volatile oils, all of the gases, and what's left behind is essentially pure carbon. Charcoal may still have some volatile oils, it may still have some of those gases. They could potentially be harmful to very young roots and seedlings, and so I don't normally advocate adding charcoal that comes from a campfire to your compost pile, but the concept is okay. If you look into biochar more and even making your own biochar, you might be able to get rid of some of those harmful compounds and then definitely add it to your compost pile. JKC054, will rabbits chew through plastic fencing to get to my garden? I am not aware of anybody I know, and I've never had that problem where rabbits will chew through fencing. Most often, they'll burrow underneath the fencing if they really want to get into that space. I think of fences and rabbits as a deterrence. Unless you bury the fence so that they can't get underneath it, you're just trying to direct them to another area. So if they encounter a fence and they can walk around it and get to some other area where there are plants that they can eat, they're not going to burrow underneath it and they're not going to chew through it. So in most cases, plastic fencing is good enough to deter the rabbits away from your garden. Lori Mohonen asked, would diluted compost tea be good for seedlings? Yes. I'm not a huge fan of compost tea in the garden. I think it's better to take your compost and put it in or on your soil. You'll get many more nutrients than if you diluted it in a bunch of water. But for seedlings, you can actually use the diluted compost tea. There will be some nutrients in that. It's going to be like a really diluted fertilizer, and the seedlings might benefit from some of that tea. So if you're looking for an organic, natural fertilizer for your seedlings, you can go ahead and use compost tea. One of my other issues is you just never know what the nutrients are and if it's the appropriate nutrients that you're looking for. So take that into account. Go ahead and try it. See if you notice a difference. I've noticed with some materials that I've used that were compost-based as a tea that it actually gives a nice little boost to the plant. So there's your lightning round for the week. I also want to go ahead and add something new, and I'm hoping to do this as we move into the future. You may have noticed last week that I gave a shout out to Leela, one of the children that watches the GardenerScott videos. Today I want to give a shout out to Dylan, an 11-year-old scout who's working on a gardening badge. And I'd like to start doing this every week. So go ahead and tell me in the comments, or if you're watching on replay, tell me on those comments. But I'd love to give shout outs to the kids that are in the garden and that are learning about gardening. I think gardening is so important for youth. I've said that in videos before. I've said it here before. If we can teach our youth to garden, we are making the world a better place. And I think one of the ways we can do that is to highlight the kids that are actually getting involved, that are in the garden, and that are watching the GardenerScott live stream and videos. So this is to you, Dylan. Congratulations. I'm glad to hear that you're working on your gardening badge. And for all the rest of you, if you have a child in your life that you'd like me to give a shout out to, I'm going to start doing that every week. So I really hope that you'll participate. and allow me to do that. And so while you're throwing in those comments, I also want to ask a question. I asked a question last week, and so I'm going to try to start doing this as well. This is to give me some ideas for future videos and future commentary. And so the question this week is, how do you prefer to garden? Are you the type of gardener that prefers to garden alone? Or are you the type of gardener that prefers to garden with someone else, like a child, like with Dylan or Leela? How do you garden? And let me know what your thoughts are on that. Because I prefer to garden with kids, but my grandkids are living in town and I'm not, and I don't see them much these days, so I end up gardening by myself almost all the time. So go ahead and answer that in the comments as well. How do you garden and how do you prefer to garden? And that'll help give us some ideas just to see what the community thinks, and maybe we can share some ideas of how to get the most enjoyment out of it when it comes to those type of things. Okay, let's go ahead and turn to another question from last week. Tone Antonsen lives in Norway. Soon I'll put out my cabbage, but I have failed for 2 years because of larvae. Do you have any good tips? And there were actually some good discussion. I appreciate Vincent Schumacher and Heidi Clark. Your answers were right on, and that's what I want to talk about, which is BT. And so BT is a bacteria. It's Bacillus thuringiensis. And you can buy BT and put it on your plants. You can also buy different types of BT and put it in water. There are different types. And so the concept of BT, it's a bacteria, and when a larva or a caterpillar eats the leaf, that bacteria is ingested, and then it kills the caterpillar from the inside out. It's important to recognize that not every type of Bacillus thuringiensis works with every type of pest. There are different bacteria that work better than others on specific pests. So if you know that you have a particular cabbage worm, you might be able to find a BT that you can sprinkle on your cabbage. The caterpillars are still going to show up. They're still going to eat those leaves, but then they're going to die. And so it lessens the damage, it reduces the population, and it really can be a good way to deal with insect pests that are eating the plants. BT doesn't work at all on the type of insects that aren't eating the plant. So it's a great fix for many pests, but you do need to know what your pest is and then get the right kind of BT. Okay, great to see stuff come in, and hopefully, Dylan, you're seeing some of these comments because you're getting people that are giving shouts out to you as well. Okay, Don Doherty is asking, why would my flower buds keep falling off on my zucchini, butternut squash, and cucumber? There could be a few reasons for that. As I talked about previously, a lot of the early flowers on those type of plants are male flowers. And so they're going to bloom. Their whole purpose is just to provide pollen for the female flowers, and then they're going to drop off. That's what they do. The female flowers are the ones that have a little bulb just below the flower. Those are the ones that are going to develop into fruit. Once they're pollinated by a male flower, the flower is going to curl up and then drop off as well. And so it's normal for the flowers on those plants to just drop off. Do learn to look at the stem that goes up to that flower. If it's long and narrow, it's a male flower. The flower falling off is no big deal at all. If it's thicker and it has that little bulb at the tip, then it's going to develop into a squash or into a zucchini. If you're seeing that the female flowers are falling off and the fruit is not developing, then it could be an issue with your pollinators, or it could be an issue with the heat. If it gets too hot, the flowers won't pollinate and they'll fall off. But I'm guessing this time of year, it's probably just because most of those flowers are male flowers and they're going to be falling off. Okay, I want to go ahead and cover a question from last week as well. It came from Heat Cap, and I am calling this the question of the week. He asks, what are considered to be good bugs? And I've got a video coming up. I'm starting to work on it now. Hopefully it'll be out in another week or so. It talks about beneficial insects. So in my videos, I'll talk about good bugs and I'll talk about beneficial insects. They're the same thing. A beneficial insect, in my opinion, is a good bug. And a good bug is something that has a benefit for your garden. So as we're talking about pollination, for instance, the squash flowers that need an insect bouncing back and forth to pollinate, those insects are good bugs. They're beneficial insects. When we have a pest like an aphid, I don't know that anyone would consider an aphid a good bug, except that they provide food for ladybugs and lacewings and lots of other beneficial insects that are in the garden eating the aphids and eating a lot of those other garden pests. So the predatory insects, and there's a lot of wasps that fall into this category, and some of these wasps are so small you won't even see them. Those are good bugs. They're playing a beneficial role in the garden by eating the bad bugs. There are insects that do a job to improve the soil. So there are many beetles. There are insects, well, for instance, let's talk about the doodle bug or the pill bug, which normally doesn't have any kind of bad activity in the garden. Most of the time, their job is to eat decaying material. And so they'll help take your mulch, and as the mulch is decomposing, a pill bug or roly-poly will come in and it will eat that material and help it decompose quicker. That's a good bug. Now, in a worst case scenario, if you're inundated with the pill bugs, they might eat live tissue, but that doesn't happen as often as you think. They're mostly eating the dead tissue. The same with a lot of those beetles. There are insects, many of them in the beetle family as well, that are burrowing into the ground. Well, as they burrow into the ground, they're creating little tunnels that allow air and water to get into the soil. Those are beneficial insects. So it's a wide array of insects, a wide range of good bugs that can do jobs in your garden that you're not even aware of, but ultimately it helps your plants grow. And so this is why I encourage that you don't use pesticides, because you might be targeting one type of insect and you end up harming some of the good insects. In almost all cases, the bad bug has half a dozen, if not more, predators that are looking for it. This last week I noticed on my peonies that are just starting to pop up, the flower heads haven't opened yet, but on those closed tips of the peonies, there are little teeny insects, very, very small, and they might be a type of aphid. I haven't looked that close, but the wonderful thing about it, my peonies are covered by ladybugs, because the ladybugs are waking up, they're looking for food, and they're just swarming over my peonies, eating all those harmful bugs. If I had seen that little bit of damage that those bugs were starting on my peonies and sprayed them, I might have been killing the ladybugs at the same time. So that's why I'm not an advocate of any of those type of chemicals, because the good bugs are out there and they're doing a good job, and look for them in your garden. And I've got a video coming up in a few days that'll talk more about integrated pest management and how you can use the good insects to your advantage. Okay, Rob is asking, why do my basil seedlings keep dying? It's hard to answer that question specifically. If you're growing them outside, the young seedlings can be very susceptible to hot conditions. And so I'll often try to shade my basil if I'm growing from seed outside because it's often hard to get them growing with the sun. That's another reason why I like to grow basil around my tomato plants, because the tomatoes will help shade the basil plants from some of that harsh sunlight. It could also be a water issue, so do check the water within your soil, the moisture content, because basil doesn't like really wet conditions or really dry conditions. They really like a nice, consistent, moist condition. So look at those type of things. And then it's also a plant that can use some nitrogen. So if your soil is depleted in nitrogen, you might benefit from giving your basil a nitrogen-based fertilizer. Okay, thank you for asking that question. Okay, Dwayne is asking, where would I be able to get a hazelnut bush? There was one on my dad's farm in Alberta, Canada. The hazelnuts on it were really good. I have seen hazelnuts in a few providers. I think Fedco, which is based in Maine, has hazelnuts. And I know that I'm pretty sure they ship to Canada as well. So look for Fedco and see if they might have it, or just do a simple search of where can I buy hazelnut, and that'll probably pop up a couple nurseries as well. Raven's Little Connecticut Garden, do you grow elderberry? Do I need 2 different species to be able to harvest berries? I do grow elderberry, and yes, in most varieties you'll need 2 different types of plants. Not always. I had an elderberry bush that I grew at a previous house. It was beautiful. It would get about 10 to 12 feet high every year. It would be covered with the flowers and then the berries, and then I'd make elderberry jelly, which is incredibly delicious, and I only had the 1 plant. So there are some varieties that will self-pollinate. You'll need to check on that ahead of time. But even those varieties that will self-pollinate will do better if you have 2 varieties. And that's the case with many different types of fruits. So elderberry, generally, yeah, you'll need 2 different types of plants. Okay, had a question from Brian Kubik. Have you tried cutting the ends of carrots and replanting? I know how hard it is to germinate them. I've seen some people do it on YouTube, but they've never completed the process. The reason they've never completed the process is because it doesn't work as you would hope. The root of a carrot is there to support the plant, and we typically harvest the carrot and eat the carrot. You can cut off the top of a carrot, plant that top, and it will start growing. But it will never grow into a carrot root. It will have some little stringy roots that will develop, and it's not strong enough to support a full plant. So one of the reasons I think you don't see the full process is because it's a fun little experiment to do in the kitchen to show kids that you can get a carrot to grow again, but that little bit of carrot top can't support a full-size carrot plant. It's not going to grow into a new carrot root, and so no one's going to show you that because that's not the part that's fun. It's just getting a little tip to grow. So do it for fun, but don't do it if you think you're going to be growing more carrots. God Emperor Corey asks, I just sprouted some seeds inside plastic bags. Do I need to harden them off before I put them in the ground? Any seeds that have started to germinate should be put into soil as soon as possible. No need for hardening off seeds at all. In fact, if you attempt to harden off seeds by putting them out in the weather or putting them out in the sun, you're going to kill that young seed. That little root is going to shrivel up and you're going to lose all of your effort. So as soon as you see a seed germinating in a plastic bag or on a wet paper towel or whatever you're using, put it into some type of soil mix right away. When the plant grows, then you can think about hardening off the plant, but there's no need to harden off the seeds. Okay. There's God Emperor Corey again. Can you cut off the top of a radish and replant it just for seeds, same as carrots? Same basic answer. A radish, if you just cut off the top, will grow into the plant, but that little bit of root that is remaining is not strong enough to support the plant to flower and produce the seeds. So if you want to save some radish seeds, just leave some of the radishes in the ground, and you don't need many. I save a lot of radish seeds. One radish left in the ground will grow into a full-size plant. Then that will flower, and then it actually develops pods. And those pods will contain between 3 and 7 seeds. And so from a single radish, you'll easily get, probably 20 to 30 pods or more. And each of those pods average maybe 5 seeds. So a single radish can easily give you 100 seeds. There's no reason to pull it out of the ground, cut it off, put it back, and hope for the plant to grow. Just leave one in the ground. That's the best way. That's what nature intended. And now that radish root that's in the ground has ample energy to support a whole new plant. That's definitely the best way to do it. Okay. I see questions, but I think the questions are coming to other people. So appreciate the answers and the questions going back and forth. City Barbs is asking, what's your position on using hydrogen peroxide for fungal issues in the garden? I've used it. I've actually used it on some of my indoor plants. It can be very effective, and it's one of those things that if you've got hydrogen peroxide, I'll just take a paper towel and wet it and rub it on the leaves, and it has been shown to work. So it's not something I do a lot of, because out in the garden, I try to provide the air circulation, and that cuts down on some of those fungal issues. And then if I have some type of bad problem, I'll usually just pull the plant and toss it away. But for the most part, I'm not using hydrogen peroxide outside. I'll just use it if it occasionally pops up as some type of control I'll need on houseplants. Okay, Keep It Simple is asking a question, and this was on my list to talk about today if you saw the description. Why do squirrels keep digging everywhere I plant something? Okay, so I wanted to talk about squirrels today, and I've had a lot of questions about squirrels in the last couple of weeks. Squirrels are one of those animals that can cause a lot of devastation in the garden. Now, they're not always digging up what you're planting. Often they're burying something that they want to save for later. So they'll dig up your garden to bury something. This is why squirrels exist, because they'll take some type of tree seed, like an acorn, and they'll bury it for later. And then they forget they buried it and where it was, and now that acorn will grow into a new tree. That's the benefit of squirrels in our wildlife biosphere, is they can plant seeds without knowing it, and then those plants will grow. However, in that process, they're also digging up some plants in the garden, and in the process of burying their seeds, they're digging up our garden. How do you deal with squirrels? It's hard to get rid of them. It's hard to put a fence around your garden to keep the squirrels out. I did see a garden in Washington State that actually had fencing all the way around and fencing on top. It was essentially a fence box, and that's what the gardener had done to keep squirrels and raccoons out. And it was about a 10-foot high fence and was completely enclosed. You can do that. One of the solutions that I found really works well, and this is what worked best for me at my last house, and this is what my brother-in-law does, and that's to feed the squirrels. And I know this runs counter to everything you're thinking about, but if squirrels have food that they can eat and not have to worry about burying, they're going to eat it. Because the reason they're burying the food is because they're trying to put food away for the winter. They're worried that they're not going to have enough food. Well, if they have enough food, they're not going to see any reason to bury anything. So they're not going to be digging in the garden in most cases. And so my brother-in-law has set up a squirrel feeder on the opposite side of his yard from the garden. And that's where the squirrels hang out. They'll come, they'll eat, they'll get their fill, and they'll be gone. And they won't show up till the next day. And he has no squirrels digging in his garden. And at the last house that I mentioned, my neighbors had bird feeders set up. A lot of bird feeders with a lot of different type of feed. That's where the squirrels hung out all the time. And the bird feeders were on the opposite side of the yard from where I had my garden. I had zero problems with squirrels. And we probably had 10 to 12 squirrels living in the trees that were within 20 feet of the garden. And they never came into the garden because it was so much easier to go to the bird feeders and get the free food. Now, yes, this might create an expense to fill the bird feeder, but you can actually grow some of the material that you would use to feed the squirrels. And so consider that as an option to deal with the squirrels. I'm not a fan of poisoning squirrels. You can try to trap the squirrels, but in my experience and from what I've read in local studies with our squirrel population, if you trap a squirrel and get it out of your yard, there's going to be another squirrel right behind it ready to move in and occupy that space. So even trapping doesn't work very well after a very short period of time. Consider the sacrifice that you'll have to make, and I do this in other areas of my garden as well. I'll put a plant, I'll put something in another section of the garden with the intent that that's where the animals that are pests will go. They'll eat whatever that is on the other side of the garden, and they're not going to bother the plants that I want to be left alone. And it's actually worked pretty well. So consider that as a way to get the squirrels out of your garden. They're burying because they're saving food for winter. If they don't have that concern, they're not going to be digging. If they're trying to eat the food in your garden and there's an easier source, they're going to go to the easier source first. So there you go. Okay, let's see if we have anything else that's popping up. Again, some good answers to other people. Blessed too, how often do you amend soil? So, for the most part, I amend the soil every year. And I do the bulk of my amending in the fall. And so, after the garden is pretty much done for the year and I'm not putting anything else in a particular bed, then I'll add a couple inches, 2 to 3 inches of compost, and I'll work it into the soil. I'm not going to till it in. I don't bring in machinery, but I'll just take a shovel and I'll just kind of turn it into the soil. And then I'll put a mulch on top, like a leaf and grass and straw mulch to cover the soil over the course of the winter. And then I leave it. And for me, that usually happens in October, and I'm not planting in that bed again until April or May. And so during that entire time period, all of that organic material that I worked into the soil has starting to decompose. And then I can plant in it in the spring and it's all ready to go. That's my preferred method. For soil that's really bad and needs a lot of amending, I'll also add another boost of compost in the spring. In early spring, as soon as the soil can be worked, I'll put some amendments like aged manure or decomposed material like compost. And I try to do that at least a month before I plant. As I mentioned earlier, there can be some nitrogen depletion. So if I do it at least a month before, the decomposition process starts, the bacteria is there, and the nitrogen depletion is not going to be as noticeable because once that material decomposes, the nitrogen within that material is now going to be released back into the soil. But if I'm doing it close to the time of planting, yeah, I'll fertilize with a nitrogen fertilizer. So always in the fall, occasionally in the spring if the soil's very poor, and then you'll get to a point, and it usually takes 4 or 5 years if you're doing this regularly. I encourage a soil test because you may find once you get to that 5% organic material and above, that you really don't need to add much more in the way of amendments because the soil has all the nutrients it needs. And you can get by with an organic mulch, and the really healthy soil will encourage the soil organisms, and they'll take that mulch and they'll continue to incorporate it into the soil. So every year for 4 or 5 years, then do a real good analysis, and then after that you might be able to get away with just mulching. So that's ideally the point to reach, where you can have that really good soil and not have to worry about amending all of the time. But it takes a little while to get there. Okay, I also wanted to talk about ants in the garden, because there was a lot of discussion last week about ants and dealing with ants. What do you do about ants? I consider ants a beneficial insect. So I just, for the most part, leave the ants, when they make their tunnels, that's the space for the air and water to get into the soil. If there's compacted soil, they help decompact it with their tunnels. They're not going to be eating the plants. They might be carrying away from some seeds and some decaying leaf matter, but most of the ants we have are not going to gang up and kill your plants. Yes, there is a correlation between ants and aphids, but the idea that ants are attacking the ladybugs, that's kind of overblown as well. And on my peonies, I saw the honeydew that was being created by the little aphids. They were filled with ladybugs, and there were also ants there too. And the ants and the ladybugs were just crawling past each other. So even that isn't much of a concern as far as whether the ants are going to interfere with the ladybugs. The ladybugs are eating the aphids. The ants are eating the honeydew. They're not necessarily protecting the aphids. There are ants that will actually bring aphids underground, and they will protect those aphids. But out in nature, that's not that big of an issue. Fire ants are a completely different issue. And I don't have fire ants. And yes, I fully understand if you've got fire ants, you want to get rid of fire ants. Diatomaceous earth can work. It's one of those things that's made from diatoms, which are microscopic skeletons of creatures. At the very small level that the insects are living, they have extremely sharp edges. And so ants and any other insect that crawls across diatomaceous earth might be harmed by it. It can be effective against ants, but if you water or if it rains, now that diatomaceous earth is just going to be washed into the mulch and it's lost all of its effectiveness. I read a report, I think it was out of Oklahoma or Texas from Extension, that said if you can find the nest and pour boiling water into the nest, that it's about 60% effective at getting rid of the ants. Also consider how the ants are traveling in your garden. If they're just walking around your bed and burrowing and they're not really a problem, let them be. But if they are in your bed and causing any type of disturbance or just bothering you, find their trail, because they'll leave smells, odors that only ants can smell along their pathway. And so one ant leaves a trail, then all the other ants follow that trail to get to whatever the destination is. All you have to do is disrupt that trail, and they're going to go someplace else. And so you can use things like vinegar, like cinnamon. There are a number of things that you can use to disrupt that trail and get rid of that smell so the ants won't follow it. That's a real easy way to do it. Just rub your foot across the ground. I'll do this occasionally. If I'm working in an area and there's a lot of ants and they're in my way of where I'm working, find the trail and just scuff up the soil around where you're working. Well, you've disrupted the trail for the ants. They're not going to continue along that pathway either. So disrupting them, ignoring them, and then potentially trying to deal with the nest is really the best way to to deal with the ants. But you've got to determine, if you don't think they're a beneficial insect, then deal with them. I think they're okay. I just let them go about their daily business. Okay, let's go ahead and look one last time, see if there's any other questions that are popping up that I need to answer right now. And good, a lot more comments coming in about ants and some of the other beneficial insects. So always good to see that. And Blackbird Garden is saying, yes, boiling water is the best when you just have to reduce them. And so a lot of non-chemical ways. Now with fire ants, if they're really bad and you can't deal with them, chemicals might be about the only thing to resort to. Try some of the other things first and see if that might be a way to deal with your ants. Okay, as we're nearing the end, let's talk a little bit about philosophy time and how I approach gardening. And of course, how I encourage others to approach gardening. But of course, you can decide your own philosophies, and I encourage you to start developing your own philosophies about gardening. And so this kind of ties in with that question that I was asking earlier, but I wanted to bring up the subject of gardening and asking who you garden for. And this really is rhetorical. You don't need to answer in the comments unless you want to. But who are you gardening for? And it could run the spectrum from you garden just because you love gardening to you have a small farm and you're gardening to either grow food for your family or to sell as a supplemental income. But I garden for myself. I see many benefits to gardening. And while I'll share plants and I'll share my produce, and I love sharing my knowledge and encouraging other gardeners to get out there and garden, I'm really doing it for myself. And I think it's okay for gardeners to admit that we're a little bit selfish. We really do want the time alone in the garden. We're gardening for ourselves. Sure, I love growing beautiful flowers, and I love the neighbors walking by and telling me that the garden looks great. I love that. And I love being able to stand back with friends and family and sit in the garden and enjoy the bees and the butterflies and the birds and sharing the space. I love that. But I'm really gardening for my own enjoyment. I mean, that's as simple as it is. So all of the time, all of the expense, all of the effort, I'm really not doing it for anybody else. I'm doing it for myself. And don't be afraid to say that. If you like gardening because you get personal satisfaction from it, well then shout it to the rooftops. Proclaim that you're a gardener, you're proud to be a gardener, you enjoy gardening, and you're going to keep doing it for yourself. That's why I keep doing it. My wife's grandfather actually died in the garden. He loved gardening. And that's how the grandchildren remember him, was always gardening. And he loved it to the point that he had a stroke and died in the garden. But I have to imagine that in that last moment, he was in the place he wished he would have been in if that happened. And I don't mean to sound morbid. I'm not trying to make this negative at all. I'm just saying, imagine that. Imagine the rest of your life and what you choose to do. If gardening is one of those things that you are choosing to do, and you're choosing to do it for yourself, then keep doing it and keep doing more of it. Because if you're enjoying gardening a little, you'll probably enjoy gardening a lot, much more. It's more work, it's more cost, it's more effort. But the big garden that you see me developing in my videos, every day I'm enjoying it more and more. And the video that I released last night with the water fountain, the solar powered fountain, that was a fun little project. I did it for the wildlife, but I was selfish about it too. I put a water fountain in my garden because I love the sound of water. And I love observing the insects that the water attracts. So sure, it's a wildlife fountain, but really it's GardenerScott's fountain because I want it in my garden. And when you choose the plants, well, grow something for yourself, solely for yourself. Don't think that you have to grow the food that your family wants to eat and that's all that you can grow. Be selfish. Go ahead and grow something for you and for no other reason. And it can be a flower, it can be a vegetable, it can be whatever you want. But I encourage all gardeners to at least have one plant that you know is your special plant. It's the plant you love more than all the other plants, and put it in a location where you will see it every single day. I have plants like that. Every time I walk into the garden, I'll see the plant. And it just gives me that really nice, warm, fuzzy feeling in my heart. It almost always, literally, brings a smile to my face when I see the plant in the location that I put it for me. And it's in that location so that I can see it every single day. It's okay to be selfish. It's okay to garden by yourself. It's okay to do what you think is best in the garden. Sure, take recommendations from others, follow the advice of others, but ultimately it's your garden, and you should be gardening for you. That's how I do it. I like to share a lot, but I'm selfish when it comes to my gardening, because if I'm not making myself happy, then I'm not doing it right. I like making myself happy, and that means I'm a little selfish. So I give you permission to be selfish in your garden, to make yourself happy, and to do what you want to do. So there you have it. A little bit of the philosophy from GardenerScott to maybe help you on your gardening journey and make it a little more enjoyable. I have a couple household kind of things that I wanted to mention. A few of you had asked about some of the merchandise that is starting to be available and if I could do some for kids. And so yes, I actually was able to add some kids t-shirts on the merchandise, and I'll be seeing some other things. It's not showing up on the YouTube like you'll see below my videos and below this live stream yet, but if you click on one of those merchandise links, it should take you to the storefront, and you'll see other options there to include some t-shirts for kids. And there's one that I designed specifically for kids that's not available in adult sizes. So if you've got some of these young gardeners that you want to recognize, go ahead and check out that GardenerScott merchandise store, and you'll see that there's some kids stuff. And so keep letting me know what you want to see, and if I can add it, I'll definitely add it. I also want to mention, because I know a lot of you have probably checked in, you maybe missed the beginning or you missed the middle. It takes a couple days, but on each of these live streams, it shows up again as a video on YouTube. And after a couple days, I'll put timestamps of all the different topics that we covered today. And I know it was more than 30 topics. So if you're just checking in, or if you missed a section and you want to go back to it, well then come back to the video. You can watch the live stream in pieces. You don't have to watch all 90 minutes at the same time. You can just go into the description box, look for the topic, or look where you stopped watching and need to pick up again. Click on that time and it'll take you right to the point in the live chat where we'll be talking about that particular subject. So I know it's hard. It's easy for me to talk about gardening all day long, but I know it can be difficult to sit through 90 minutes of a live stream or to sit through 90 minutes of a video. Well, please don't feel obligated to do that. You can mix it up, you can break it apart into little chunks, and I'm trying to help out to make that easy for you by putting the times when you can get to it. So I hope you take advantage of that. As I've said before, this is kind of a video encyclopedia of gardening information that you can use in the future. And so feel free to go back to some of the other videos, because all of the other live streams have that timestamp to be able to find the topics that we were talking about. And especially as we move forward and we start doing shout outs to the kids, I'll definitely have the shout outs time-stamped. So your kid doesn't have to watch a full 90 minutes. They can go to that point in the video, hear their name, and know that they've been acknowledged and recognized. So I hope that helps and makes it a little bit easier. Keep giving me suggestions on other things, on how I can improve not only the live stream, but my videos and the GardenerScott channel overall. So it's wonderful to see everybody checking in throughout the day. Appreciate all the information. Thanks, Derek. I thought it was a great chat today, too. I'm so glad to be involved with your gardening week. I'm so glad that you allow me to share my gardening week and all the rest of the information. For those of you that are in the United States, I hope you have an opportunity to get out and enjoy your Memorial Day. I'm guessing it probably involves a little bit of gardening. I'm definitely going to be out there and doing some gardening as well. And as to the rest of the week, make the most of it. I'm going to be putting some of my tomatoes in the ground this week, which is one of the most exciting times of the year. Thank you so much for joining me today, sharing your time with me. I look forward to seeing you next week on the live stream, and for you and me to share our comments on the videos along the way. I'm GardenerScott. Enjoy gardening.